Today we're going to explore a fascinating culinary science question. Why does adding just a small amount of sugar to an acidic sauce, like tomato sauce, make it taste less sour, more rounded, and sometimes even less salty? To understand this phenomenon, we need to start with the fundamental chemistry of taste perception. When you taste food, your tongue has specialized receptor cells that detect different taste molecules. Sour taste is detected by hydrogen ions, also called protons. Sweet taste is detected by sugar molecules binding to completely different receptors on your tongue. The human tongue can detect 5 basic tastes: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami. Each has its own specialized receptor type. Let's start with a key question. How exactly does acidity create that sour taste we experience? When acids dissolve in water, they dissociate and release hydrogen ions, or protons. These hydrogen ions are what your taste receptors detect as sourness. For example, citric acid breaks down into hydrogen ions plus citrate ions. The pH scale measures the concentration of these hydrogen ions. Lower pH means more hydrogen ions, which means more sourness. Tomato sauce typically has a pH around 4 to 4.5, which is quite acidic. The higher the concentration of hydrogen ions, the lower the pH, and the more sour it tastes. Fresh tomatoes and tomato sauce are naturally acidic, with a pH between 4 and 4.5. Now let's explore the first mechanism by which sugar reduces sourness: taste receptor competition. This is a neurological phenomenon. Your brain integrates signals from multiple taste receptors simultaneously. When sweet receptors are activated alongside sour receptors, the brain perceives a different overall taste profile. The key insight is that taste perception is not simply additive. Your brain doesn't just sum up the individual tastes. Instead, different taste signals interact and modulate each other through neural processing. Here's an important question many people get wrong. Is the sugar actually neutralizing the acid chemically? The answer is no. Sugar is not a base. It does not chemically neutralize the hydrogen ions. The pH of the sauce remains essentially the same after adding sugar. The acids and hydrogen ions are still present in the same concentration. What changes is how your brain perceives and interprets the taste signals. If you measure the pH before and after adding sugar, you'll find they're virtually identical. The chemical reality hasn't changed, but the perceptual reality has. The second mechanism is called taste suppression or taste masking. This is a well-documented phenomenon in food science. Research has shown that sweet compounds can suppress the perception of bitter, salty, and sour tastes. This is a psychophysical effect, not a chemical one. When sugar is present, it doesn't eliminate the sour signal, but it reduces its perceived intensity. The brain interprets a weak or sour signal, even though the actual chemical stimulus is unchanged. The degree of suppression depends on the concentration of sugar. More sugar creates stronger suppression, but there are diminishing returns, and eventually you just taste sweetness. The third mechanism involves physical changes to the sauce. Sugar doesn't just affect taste receptors, it also changes the texture and viscosity of the liquid. When you dissolve sugar in a liquid, you increase its viscosity. The sauce becomes slightly thicker and more viscous. This increased viscosity affects how the sauce interacts with your taste buds. A thicker sauce coats your tongue differently and may reduce the rate at which hydrogen ions reach the sour receptors. The kinetics of taste perception change with viscosity. In a more viscous solution, taste molecules diffuse more slowly to receptors, which can alter the perceived intensity and duration of taste. Now let's address another fascinating aspect. Why does sugar sometimes make food taste less salty? Just as sweet taste suppresses sour perception, it also suppresses salty perception through similar neural mechanisms. Salt taste comes from sodium ions binding to specific receptors. When sweet receptors are simultaneously activated, the brain integrates these signals and the perceived saltiness decreases. There's mutual suppression between sweet, sour, and salty tastes. This is why a balanced sauce often contains elements of multiple taste categories. Now let's look at a more subtle chemical mechanism. While sugar itself doesn't change pH, the tomato sauce contains natural buffering compounds. Tomatoes naturally contain citric acid, malic acid, and their corresponding salts. These form buffer systems. A buffer system consists of a weak acid and its conjugate base in equilibrium. This equilibrium can shift based on conditions. Adding sugar changes the ionic strength and water activity of the solution. This can cause very slight shifts in the buffering equilibria, potentially reducing free hydrogen ion activity by a small amount. However, this chemical buffering effect is relatively minor. The primary effects we discussed earlier, the neurological taste suppression and masking, are much more significant. Let's explore what chefs mean when they say sugar makes a sauce taste more rounded or balanced. What does it actually mean, from a scientific perspective, to say a taste is rounded? Flavor perception is multidimensional. When only one taste dominates, like sourness, the flavor profile is one-dimensional and unbalanced. Imagine taste as a radar chart with different dimensions. A sauce with only sourness creates a spike in one direction. This is perceived as harsh or unbalanced. When you add sugar, you activate a second dimension. Now the taste profile becomes more complex and distributed across multiple dimensions. This is what we perceive as rounded or balanced. Food scientists have actually quantified these effects using sensory evaluation panels and statistical methods. Trained sensory panels use standardized scales to rate taste intensity. Studies have shown that adding 1 to 2% sugar by weight to tomato sauce can reduce perceived sourness by 20 to 40%. The relationship can be modeled mathematically. Perceived sourness is inversely proportional to 1 plus a constant times the sugar concentration. There are diminishing returns. After a certain point, adding more sugar doesn't further reduce sourness perception. Instead, you just taste sweetness. For most tomato sauces, the optimal amount of sugar is between 1 and 3% by weight. This provides maximum rounding effect without making the sauce noticeably sweet. An important consideration is that taste perception varies significantly between individuals. People have genetic variations in their taste receptor genes. Some people are supertasters with more taste buds and higher sensitivity, while others are non-tasters with lower sensitivity. Supertasters perceive sourness and bitterness much more intensely. They typically need more sugar to balance acidic foods. Non-tasters perceive these tastes less intensely and need less sugar. Taste sensitivity also changes with age. Children have more taste buds and higher sensitivity, which is why they often prefer sweeter foods. Sensitivity decreases as we age. Let's discuss the practical implications of this science for cooking and food preparation. When adjusting sauce flavor, add sugar gradually in small increments. Taste after each addition because the effect is not linear and you can easily overshoot. Add sugar relatively late in the cooking process after other flavors have developed. This allows you to taste the base flavor profile before adjusting. Let the sauce rest for a few minutes after adding sugar. Taste perception takes time to equilibrate, and immediate tasting may not reflect the final flavor. Consider using a mixture of sweeteners. A combination of white sugar and a small amount of honey or balsamic vinegar can provide both sweetness and additional flavor complexity. Remember that sugar works best in combination with appropriate levels of salt and umami. The goal is overall balance, not just masking sourness with sweetness. While we focused on sugar, other ingredients can also balance acidity through different mechanisms. Fats like butter or olive oil coat the tongue and create a barrier that slows the delivery of taste molecules to receptors. This smooths out harsh acidic flavors. Dairy products like cream contain proteins such as casein that can bind to taste compounds and reduce their availability to receptors. Unlike sugar, bases like baking soda actually do neutralize acids chemically through an acid-base reaction. However, this changes the chemistry of the food and can create off flavors if not done carefully. For example, hydrochloric acid reacts with sodium bicarbonate to produce sodium chloride, water, and carbon dioxide gas. Let's dive deeper into how the brain integrates multiple taste signals. Taste information from the tongue travels through cranial nerves, to the brainstem, then to the thalamus, and finally, to the gustatory cortex in the brain. At each stage of processing, there is integration and modulation of signals. By the time taste information reaches conscious perception, it has been heavily processed, and multiple taste signals have been integrated. Flavor is not just taste. It includes smell, texture, temperature, and even visual appearance. All these modalities interact in the brain to create the overall flavor experience. Can we actually measure these taste interactions in the brain using modern neuroscience techniques? Yes, we can. Functional MRI studies have shown that different combinations of tastes activate different patterns in the gustatory cortex and associated brain regions. Studies show that sweet and sour tastes activate partially overlapping brain regions, and the pattern of activation for the combination is different from either taste alone. Let's look specifically at the chemistry of tomato sauce and why sugar is particularly effective in this context. Tomatoes are rich in glutamic acid, which provides umami taste. This already adds one dimension of flavor complexity. Glutamic acid and its salt form, glutamate, bind to umami receptors on the tongue. When tomatoes are cooked, Maillard reactions between sugars and amino acids create hundreds of new flavor compounds. These add depth and complexity to the sauce. Different tomato varieties contain different amounts of natural sugars. San Marzano tomatoes, for example, are sweeter than Roma tomatoes. Riper tomatoes have more sugar than less ripe ones. The amount of sugar you need to add depends on the natural sugar content of your tomatoes. A sauce made from very acidic, unripe tomatoes will need more sugar than one made from sweet, ripe, heirloom tomatoes. Understanding the evolutionary origins of taste helps explain why these interactions exist. Sweet taste evolved as a signal for energy-rich, calorie-dense foods like ripe fruits. Our ancestors who sought out sweet foods had better survival and reproduction. Sour taste evolved as a warning signal. Very sour foods are often unripe or beginning to spoil through fermentation. Extreme sourness triggered avoidance behavior. The fact that sweetness suppresses sourness may be an evolved mechanism to help us identify the most nutritious foods. A food that is both sweet and sour, like a ripe fruit, may represent an optimal nutritional target. The food industry exploits these taste interactions extensively. Many processed foods are engineered with precise ratios of sweet, sour, and salty components to maximize palatability. Let me summarize the key scientific principles we've covered. First, and most important, sugar does not chemically neutralize acid. The pH remains essentially unchanged. Second, sweetness suppresses sour perception through neural mechanisms in the brain, not through chemical reactions. Third, multiple mechanisms work together, including taste receptor competition, neural suppression, viscosity changes, and possibly minor buffering effects. Fourth, the effect is dose-dependent. Small amounts of sugar have large effects, but there are diminishing returns at higher concentrations. Fifth, there is significant individual variation in taste perception due to genetic factors and age-related changes in taste sensitivity. Based on this science, here are practical recommendations for achieving optimal flavor balance in acidic sauces. Start with approximately 1% sugar by weight of your sauce. For a 500-gram batch of sauce, that's 5 grams, or about 1 teaspoon of sugar. Add sugar relatively late in the cooking process, after other flavors have developed. This allows you to taste the base flavor profile before adjusting. Let the sauce rest for a few minutes after adding sugar. Taste perception takes time to equilibrate, and immediate tasting may not reflect the final flavor. Consider using a mixture of sweeteners. A combination of white sugar and a small amount of honey or balsamic vinegar can provide both sweetness and additional flavor complexity. Remember that sugar works best in combination with appropriate levels of salt and umami. The goal is overall balance, not just masking sourness with sweetness. The interaction between sugar and acid in cooking beautifully illustrates how cooking is both an art and a science. Science gives us the mechanisms. We understand the chemistry, the neurobiology, and the psychophysics of taste perception. But art determines the optimal balance. There is no single correct answer, because taste preferences are subjective and culturally influenced. However, understanding the underlying science makes you a more informed and skilled cook. You can make intentional decisions rather than following recipes blindly. The best way to master flavor balance is through experimentation. Try the same sauce with different amounts of sugar. Train your palate to detect the differences. This is how professional chefs develop their skills.